Previously, we'd watched as Princess Eve was imprisoned after the fall of the Hadelamite Empire, fully aware that the rebellion led by Michaelis Agneto had sealed her fate. While she waited for her execution, her sister Rosnet, chosen to survive and legitimize the new regime, visited her cell. Cloaked in false kindness, Rosnet offered Eve belladonna poison, promising a painless death. Believing this to be a final mercy, Eve drank it, only to realize too late that Rosnet had come to personally ensure her end. As the poison took hold and her body began to fail, Rosnet watched, mocking her, and Eve died, betrayed not by the fallen empire, but by her own sister. After Eve's death, her end was not treated as final, it became a ritualized necessity. As the belladonna shut down her body, Eve's consciousness did not disappear. Instead, it was drawn toward the Philosopher's Stone, the same imperial relic that legitimized rulers and bound time to royal blood. The empire's collapse, Michaelis's reign, and Rosnet's survival all converged around this artifact. In her final moments, Eve became aware that her death was being used. The stone responded to her imperial blood and unresolved will, activating a forbidden ritual that rewound time. Her life, regrets, and memories were preserved as the world itself turned backward. In her final moments, Eve pieced together the larger scheme. Michaelis had never intended to kill Rosnet. She had been kept alive only because of the sages, philosophers, stone, which required imperial blood. However, Michaelis had needed insurance. If only one imperial survivor remained, Rosnet could have betrayed him or failed to secure the next generation. Eve, imprisoned in the birdcage bedroom rather than the dungeon, had been preserved as a replacement royal, a backup vessel. Rosnet, driven by a strong desire for monopoly, could not tolerate Eve's continued existence, and had therefore chosen to eliminate her personally. The irony struck Eve too late. The clarity she had lacked while alive returned only as she crossed the threshold of death. Realizing that everything had been a trap, she died in anguish, betrayed, furious, and heartbroken, unable to close her eyes in peace. Then, unexpectedly, Eve woke up. She found herself alive and breathing, her body functioning normally despite having died from poison. The pain and paralysis caused by belladonna were gone. Confused and shaken, she recognized a familiar ceiling and realized she was not in the birdcage bedroom. Instead, she was in her old bedroom from her youth, a room she had not used since she was 23, and that should have been a storage space. Suspecting madness or delusion, Eve forced herself to stay calm and began testing reality. She concentrated and sensed the mana around her, determining that this was not illusion magic. When she stood before the mirror, she was shocked to see her younger body, appearing like a teenager. Her face, hair, and even her messy braid matched her childhood self, down to details too precise to be fantasy. At that point, Eve formed a hypothesis: she had regressed in time. Although time reversal should have been impossible without sage-level power, she accepted that a miracle had occurred. Rather than panic, she resolved to act. When Sedila, Eve's exclusive maid, entered the room, her presence further confirmed reality. Through their conversation, Eve learned the date indirectly. It was shortly before Rosnet's 16th birthday, meaning Eve was now 8 years younger than when she died. Sedila excitedly spoke about the upcoming direct homunculus night selection ceremony, an important imperial event. Eve remembered that in her previous life, Rosnet had chosen Sylvestian Milad, a silver-haired homunculus knight valued more for appearance than humanity, abused him for 3 years, and later discarded him in favor of Michaelis. Eve also realized that information she had once ignored, gossip from the Hadelun Times, had real strategic value. Instead of dismissing it, she encouraged Sedila to continue sharing such news, recognizing that information was power in this second life. As Eve drank her tea and reflected on her past mistakes, she resolved to live differently. She would no longer isolate herself or remain passive. This time, she would move flexibly, gather knowledge, and survive. And with that resolve, Eve decided on her goal. She would become crown princess. Eve finished her tea and drank water as Sedila hesitantly revealed that many homunculi wished to swear loyalty to Eve, despite her lack of power or backing. Eve dismissed it lightly, joking that Sedila should not trust gossip papers like the Hadelun Times. However, Sedila insisted it was not rumor, but her own observation. Eve had a genuine reputation among homunculi. Their conversation failed to align in sincerity. Sedila expressed quiet frustration, wishing Eve would appoint a direct knight, believing it would protect her position. Eve did not grow angry. Instead, she apologized for having caused Sedila hardship through her stubbornness. Sedila was special to Eve, the only person who had remained at her side despite Eve's isolation and unpopularity within the imperial palace. Eve reflected on the source of her marginalization. Her mother had been a commoner alchemist, not a noble nor a member of the Imperial Alchemists Association, and her rise to empress had drawn scorn from aristocratic society. Unable to endure palace life, her mother had died when Eve was still young, leaving Eve without protection. Worse, her mother had believed that all conscious beings, including homunculi, deserved dignity, a belief Eve inherited. This conviction made Eve an outcast in a palace that viewed homunculi as tools, not people. By rejecting imperial traditions such as appointing a direct knight, Eve became despised by both the royal family and palace officials. Her budget was minimal, her life more frugal than that of most noble girls. Sedila, despite receiving offers from other royal households, had never abandoned her. In her previous life, Eve had failed to protect Sedila and deeply regretted it. Determined not to repeat that mistake, Eve promised Sedila that she would make her strong and that their paths would rise together. Moved, Sedila accepted, and they resolved to endure side by side. As they prepared for the day, Eve asked about the morning greeting with Emperor Desmond II. Sedila revealed the attendees: the third Princess Bridget, the eighth Princess Rosnet, Eve herself, and two princes. The combination immediately alarmed Eve. She remembered this exact morning from her previous life, the day Bridget had manipulated the discussion on declining gemstone output, proposed harsher labor quotas for homunculi, and twisted Eve's defense of humane treatment into an act of rebellion. Rosnet had added fuel to the situation, feigning innocence and tears, and Desmond, too, irritated and unwilling to listen, had expelled Eve without allowing her to defend herself. That incident had permanently damaged Eve's standing and contributed to disastrous imperial policies. Realizing she had returned to this crucial turning point, Eve grew resolute. This day was not ordinary, it was a battlefield. Sedila, sensing Eve's resolve, smiled and presented her with the most splendid dress. "You have to make it tight," she said. Eve accepted, preparing to face the past differently this time. Sedila dressed Eve carefully for the morning greeting, choosing a cream-colored silk dress embroidered with green leaves that complemented Eve's light lime-blonde hair. Knowing she would face Princess Bridget's elegance and Princess Rosnet's calculated charm at the same time, Sedila aimed for a balance between refinement and softness. Eve agreed. She had no intention of competing head-on yet. For the first time, Eve actively participated in her own adornment. She accepted that in the imperial palace, appearance was a political duty. Drawing on memories from her past life, she predicted her sister's styles and chose a hairstyle that avoided direct comparison. Light makeup softened her features, and this time, Eve deliberately chose heavier accessories, pomegranate-colored jewels once owned by her mother, deciding to borrow her mother's strength for the day. Before leaving, Eve prepared a headache relief tea for Emperor Desmond II, carefully blending ingredients from her private collection. Tea blending had always been her quiet refuge, and she treated it with the same care as alchemy. On her way through the East Palace, Eve greeted her sisters according to imperial hierarchy. As usual, she was ignored or brushed aside, treated as an inconvenience rather than royalty. Sedila bristled with anger, but Eve remained calm, accustomed to such humiliation. She remembered how, in her previous life, this treatment had escalated into open cruelty. Stepping outside, Eve felt sunlight on her skin for the first time in what felt like ages. The moment stirred her deeply. This was the first step of a new life. Before she could go far, a familiar voice stopped her. Princess Rosnet appeared, radiant in pale pink, her beauty flawless and her smile sweet. The sight of her sent a chill through Eve. Memories of betrayal, poison, and mocking laughter echoed in her mind. Eve steadied herself, hiding her hatred behind composure. Rosnet greeted her warmly, commenting on Eve's appearance with faintly insincere praise. Eve returned the politeness, steering the conversation away from tension. She suggested they go together to the morning greeting. As they walked, Eve noticed the silver-haired homunculus knight following Rosnet. Recognizing him from memory, she waited. Rosnet introduced him at last. His name was Sylvestian Millard, a homunculus knight of the Imperial Guard, summoned to escort her to the main palace. Eve understood immediately. This was the beginning. The same pieces were moving into place once more. It was unusual for a specific homunculus knight to be summoned for such a short and safe escort. Eve immediately understood what it implied. Rosenet's influence was already at work, her name quietly circulating through gossip long before any formal ceremony. As Eve considered this, the silver-haired knight stepped forward. Sylvestian Millard greeted her properly, addressing her as the seventh princess. Eve permitted him to raise his head and studied him with conflicted eyes. He was Rosenet's most prized knight, yet Eve remembered the future awaiting him, total devotion repaid with abandonment. The sight left her faintly uneasy. She praised his skill in swordsmanship and magic, offering carefully chosen words that sounded like courtesy but carried a quiet wish that he might one day serve a better master. Sylvestian hesitated, caught off guard, explaining that nobles usually noticed only his silver hair. Eve realized her sincerity had unsettled him. With the exchange concluded, Eve urged Rosenet onward. They walked side by side through the palace gardens, keeping a measured distance from the knight and their attendants. Mana-powered watering golems activated around them, spraying water in elegant arcs that formed brief rainbows, another reminder of how deeply alchemy and magic were woven into imperial life. Rosenet complained about the distance and demanded to use warp magic, but palace laws and surveillance golems made it impossible. Eve patiently endured Rosenet's irritation until they finally reached the main palace, Royal Gracia. Sylvestian was dismissed to stand by as they entered the inner hall. Guided by the guards, Eve and Rosenet ascended via the mana platform to the Emerald Hall on the 7th floor. When the green doors opened, Eve steadied herself. This was the battlefield. Bridget, Rubens, and Icalis were already present, seated according to succession. Eve's gaze lingered on Bridget, the poised, capable sister once chosen as heir. In her previous life, Eve had respected her deeply and mourned what she later became. After formal greetings, Rosenet was immediately surrounded by flattery from the two princes. Their praise lifted Rosenet while subtly cutting Eve down, turning the green of the hall and the green tint of Eve's hair into a decorative contrast meant to elevate Rosenet's beauty. Eve remained silent, recognizing the game being played. Then the hall doors opened. Emperor Desmond II entered, resplendent and authoritative. The room rose as one. Eve looked at her father, alive, dignified, unaware, and felt her chest tighten. She remembered how, in the future, he would be the first to die when the rebellion began. Her eyes burned as she greeted him inwardly, grief and resentment tangled together. This moment, she knew, was only the beginning. Desmond II, a man who had fathered 18 children, had never truly been a good father. The fleeting thrill Eve felt upon seeing him again quickly dissolved into resentment toward an emperor whose single misguided choice would one day destroy the empire itself. She steadied her breathing and composed her expression as Desmond II motioned for everyone to sit. He rubbed his forehead absently, a small, habitual gesture that went unnoticed by all but Eve. When he called for tea, she rose at once. Eve presented the blend she had prepared herself, claiming it as a personal hobby. Desmond II tasted it and immediately approved, pleased by both the flavor and the thoughtfulness behind it. When Eve explained its medicinal purpose, headache relief made from lemon balm and rooibos, he laughed warmly, clearly touched that his 13th daughter had noticed his discomfort. Encouraged, Eve leaned into the role she had learned in her previous life, offering affection in careful doses. The emperor responded exactly as she remembered. His praise echoed through the Emerald Hall, disrupting the established hierarchy and drawing stunned reactions from everyone present. Bridget's faint tension, Rubens's forced approval, and Rosenet's quiet disbelief. Rubens offered a half-hearted compliment, belittling Eve even as he praised her tea. Eve responded calmly, linking tea blending to alchemy and subtly redirecting the credit back to Desmond II himself. The tactic worked. The emperor laughed, openly comparing Eve's talent to his own and declaring her worthy of high recognition. Sensing the danger of provoking Bridget further, Eve lowered herself modestly, praising her elder sister and deflecting attention away from herself. Desmond II joked, but the message landed. Then Rosenet spoke. She approached Desmond II gently, feigning insecurity and affection. He softened immediately, indulging her words without resistance. Struggled for a response before laughing awkwardly and steering Rosenet away from further embarrassment. She expressed anxiety over the future engraving ceremony, the selection of a direct homunculus knight. Claiming she lacked talent in magic and alchemy, she painted herself as fragile and uncertain. Desmond too reassured her without hesitation, but Rosnit's true intent soon surfaced. She turned the conversation toward Eve, deliberately drawing attention to the one princess who had refused a direct knight for over a year. The table fell silent. All eyes shifted to Eve, their gazes sharp and familiar. Desmond too spoke at last, acknowledging Eve's talent and lamenting her refusal to follow imperial tradition. His frustration surfaced openly as he scolded her stubbornness, though he eventually tried to wave the matter aside. Then Eve spoke. She calmly denied his assumption and rose without assistance. Bowing properly, she admitted that her refusal had been born of selfish conviction and that she had reflected deeply on her actions. In a voice steady and composed, she declared her intention to take a direct knight. Shock rippled through the Emerald Hall. Even Desmond too stared at her in disbelief before breaking into delighted praise. He welcomed her decision with visible relief, eager to discuss the details. Eve requested that the ceremony be held quietly that very day, citing Rosnit's upcoming banquet and arguing that attention should remain focused on her sister for the sake of public sentiment. The Emperor was impressed by Eve's restraint, her political awareness, and her filial reasoning. When he asked whether she had already chosen a homunculus, curiosity spread through the hall. Eve hesitated only briefly. She met her father's gaze and named her choice. Michaelis Agneto. The name meant nothing to them. So she clarified, referring to him as the monster imprisoned in the public camp. The reaction was immediate. Shock deeper than before settled over the table. Desmond too's expression hardened, his authority pressing down like a weight. For the first time that day, true tension returned. Rubens rose at once, unable to contain himself, and sharply demanded to know what Eve was thinking. And just like that, the room turned hostile. Rubens erupted in disbelief, openly calling Michaelis a monster who had refused allegiance to the Emperor himself. His agitation only worsened the situation. Desmond too's authority had been insulted. Eve immediately corrected him, calmly reframing the failure as something no ordinary homunculus could achieve. At her words, Desmond too's expression darkened, and Rubens was silenced at once. When the Emperor asked again whether Eve truly intended to imprint the prisoner, she answered without hesitation. Michaelis Agneto had never completed the Oath of Allegiance, a ritual personally conducted by Desmond II to bind homunculi to the imperial family. Any normal failure would have been disposed of immediately. Michaelis survived only because his power was too great to discard. Enraged, the Emperor had imprisoned him instead, consigning him to a public prison infamous for cruelty, and over time allowed the problem to fade from memory. Michael's existence had become a stain on imperial authority. Eve knew the danger of invoking his name. To claim a homunculus the Emperor himself could not subdue bordered on rebellion. One wrong word could have sealed Michaelis's execution. She chose every sentence carefully. She reframed the oath as a blessing, not a test of obedience, expressing pity for a homunculus who had never been allowed to properly receive it. She praised Desmond II's overwhelming authority, subtly implying that a single failure did not diminish his greatness. Then she offered a solution. The fault, she suggested, lay not in defiance, but in a damaged mana circuit. Michaelis was not rebellion incarnate, he was unfinished. Eve proposed to fix what had been neglected. To remove the thorn that had lingered in the Empire's palm for 3 years. She bowed deeply and asked for permission. After a long pause, Desmond too relented. As both Emperor and alchemist, he acknowledged Eve's challenge-driven nature and allowed her to proceed. But his approval came with a condition. If Eve failed to imprint Michaelis, she herself would be responsible for his disposal. Eve accepted without flinching. With the morning audience concluded, she formally excused herself, aware that her declaration marked her true entry into the War of Succession. She and Sedila traveled to the protocol department, which handled the formal procedures for appointing direct knights. Through an imperial warp portal, they were transported to the Homunculus Training Center, an isolated facility hidden beyond the Empire's maps, sealed within perpetual blizzards and layered magical barriers. The Empire created roughly 100 homunculus infants each year. All were raised here. For 15 years they were trained, graded, and stripped of choice. High grades became imperial knights or private property of royalty. Mid-grades were sent to lethal frontlines. Low grades had their mana sealed and were worked to exhaustion. At the heart of the frozen valley lay the public prison. Baron Pt2, the facility's overseer, guided Eve through narrow rock corridors carved like a mine shaft. Along the way, he explained the effects of long-term mana restraints, how they drained power and bleached hair color, leaving homunculi pale and doll-like. Only special cases, like Sylvestian, retained their natural coloring. Michaelis, however, had never had his restraints removed. At the end of the corridor, the space opened into a vast hollow. Suspended from the ceiling by chains was an aerial prison, a steel cage hanging high above the ground. Eve ascended on a disc platform and finally saw him. Michaelis was bound in layers of restraint, shackles on wrists and ankles, a suppressive collar, chains binding him in place. He leaned against the iron bars with closed eyes, unmoving, like a captured beast long forgotten. This was Michael, 8 years earlier. Eve realized then why he had been named after the archangel. His hair, freed only in color, not in power, was a soft saffron pink, a hue impossible to imagine on the black-haired man she had known. Even imprisoned, even neglected for 3 years, his beauty was unsettling. Wild, overgrown hair framed his face like a mane, lending him the air of a mythical creature rather than a prisoner. Baron Urka spoke with crude fascination, calling him a doll. Eve did not answer. At that moment, Michael's eyes opened. Slowly, he lifted his head. And for the first time in this life, Eve met his gaze. Michael's purple eyes met Eve's, unchanged from her memory, vivid and dangerously captivating. Even imprisoned in iron and chains, his beauty remained intact, and with it, his power to unsettle. Eve steadied herself, aware that this very allure had once helped spark rebellion. Michael, confused and shaken, struggled to understand the presence of a richly dressed woman before him. When Baron Urka harshly demanded his obedience, the spark of hostility in Michael's gaze sharpened into something murderous. Eve intervened, silencing the Baron and stepping alone into the cage. In the suffocating stillness of the aerial prison, Eve and Michael faced each other. The roles had reversed from her past life, now he was bound, and she stood free. Instead of hatred, Eve felt pity and a lingering sorrow for the boy who had once risen from despair to become her executioner. Calling him by name softened something in Michael. Though wary and openly defiant, he listened. Eve revealed herself not as the 8th princess he assumed, but as the 7th Evian Rose Clol Hadelamide, and invited him to speak without formality. Michael questioned her motives. He had heard she despised the system of direct knights, yet she stood before him now offering exactly that bond. Eve admitted the contradiction. She needed a knight to survive. She had chosen him. Disappointment hardened Michael's tone. Believing Eve no different from the rest of the imperial family, he mocked her intentions and rejected the illusion of mercy. His bitterness surfaced openly, his sneer sharp and unguarded, proof that beneath the chains stood a man who would never kneel easily, and whose resentment toward the empire was already fully alive. Michael wavered, unsettled by Eve's insistence. Her sincerity disturbed him more than threats ever could. When she told him she had not come because she needed a knight, but because she needed him, something cracked, just slightly, in his guarded composure. He questioned her motives, doubted her promises, and pointed out the emptiness of words in a system built on forced obedience. Eve did not deny it. She admitted she had nothing tangible to offer except trust, and that she would never use imprinting to humiliate or control him. Still, she asked him to believe her. Michael tested her further, challenging her confidence, mocking the contradiction of her ideals. Eve answered without arrogance, certain she could imprint him only if he did not reject her outright, and just as certain she would not force him. Her calm conviction unsettled him. Despite himself, Michael felt drawn into her rhythm. Yet hatred resurfaced. He confessed openly that he despised the imperial family, that being bound to someone he hated was a cruelty beyond chains. Eve accepted this without protest. She did not demand loyalty or devotion, only the minimum role of a knight. Still unconvinced, Michael accused her of ulterior motives, of wanting to dominate a rebellious homunculus. Eve denied it plainly, almost wearily, and asked him again, this time reaching out her hand, not as a princess, but as a person. Michael hesitated. Her hand looked impossibly warm in the cold darkness of the prison. He nearly took it, then stopped himself, reminding himself of who she was. Then Eve spoke the words that shattered his resistance. She told him to come out with her. The thought stole his breath. 3 years of isolation had hollowed him out more than hatred ever had. In the end, it was not allegiance that moved him, but the desperate desire to leave the cage. Michael admitted it. Even if it meant imprinting, even if it meant chains of another kind, he wanted to get out. Eve did not wait for him to reach for her. She stepped closer, lowered herself to his level, and took his trembling hand first. Warm light flowed between them as she promised softly that they would leave together. The warmth that flowed from Eve's hand was something Michael had never known. It wrapped around him gently, like an embrace, leaving him momentarily dazed. When he murmured that her hand was warm, Eve explained it was simple warming magic, then increased it slightly at his request. Though embarrassed by his reaction, Michael could not stop his gaze from lingering on her hand after she let go. Eve announced the start of the imprinting ceremony. Unlike other nights' rituals, there would be no grand spectacle. Imprinting was both magic and alchemy, an absolute contract engraved into the soul of a homunculus, and alchemy played the greater role. Eve drew a precise alchemical circle on her palm with red magic ink and pressed her hand to Michael's, copying the sigil as their fingers interlaced. Before the ritual began in earnest, Michael warned her. His resistance had once repelled even the Emperor's dominance. If the ritual recoiled, Eve's life would be in danger. She dismissed the concern lightly, teasing him for sounding worried, then focused her concentration. When Eve invoked the royal imprint, violent recoil followed. Wind surged, chains screamed, and the aerial prison shook. Michael urged her to stop, but Eve pressed on, revealing her secret preparation. One by one, jewel-like hairpins shattered, each a forbidden amplification alchemy stone, disguised as ornamentation. They were artifacts rivaling imperial relics, crafted by a sage-class alchemist. Eve claimed them as her mother's keepsakes and used them without hesitation. Michael realized then how determined she was. No royal would expend such resources on a single homunculus. Eve confirmed it plainly, Michaelis Agneto was worth it. She needed him. As the final stones broke, the alchemical circles dissolved into light and were absorbed. For a moment, Eve wondered if it had succeeded, then a violent shockwave erupted. The aerial prison lurched wildly, and Eve lost her footing, slipping toward the iron bars. Before she could fall, strong arms wrapped around her waist. Michael had caught her. When the shock finally settled and no pain came, Eve slowly opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was Michael's purple gaze, close, steady, unmistakably real. One of his arms was firmly around her waist, holding her upright, while the other braced against the iron bars of the tilted aerial prison. Only then did Eve notice it. His hands were free. The restraints that had bound Michael's mana circuits, handcuffs, chains, suppression, had shattered during the imprint. Freed mana surged through him, and in seconds his saffron-pink hair darkened, returning to its original black. As the cage swung back into balance, Michael instinctively shielded Eve with his body, pressing her safely against the bars. The movement was so natural it startled her. Heat crept up the tips of her ears. This was her first time being protected like this. Once the prison stabilized, Michael released her and spoke calmly, as if nothing remarkable had happened. "It seems you succeeded." Eve's eyes lit up. The imprint had worked. Michael explained the change with quiet detachment. His body now reacted before thought, moving automatically to prevent her harm. It was proof. The imprint bound him completely. Eve asked softly if he was all right. "I don't think I have a choice," he replied. "Engraving is the most unfair contract there is. More than slavery. Never less." When he called her his owner, Eve flinched, but emotion welled in her eyes. She had done it. She had secured Michaelis Agneto. The rebellion of her past life had been stopped at its root. Relief came crashing down all at once. Exhaustion followed. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed. Michael hurried to her side, startled, helping her up with blunt concern. Only then did he remark, almost thoughtfully, that humans really were weaker than homunculi. Eve smiled and accepted his hand. "Good luck, Sir Agneto." Thus, Michael took her hand willingly for the first time. Back at the palace, Eve had just come back from receiving her reward for imprinting Michaelis, and it was on her way to her room she met Sylvester Millard. He greeted and asked, almost hesitantly, whether she'd truly taken a direct night. When Eve confirmed it, his composure faltered. At the mention of Michaelis Agneto, recognition flickered across his face, the monster in the public prison. After a moment's hesitation, Sylvester masked his reaction behind his usual expressionless courtesy before departing. Eve was handed the gold coin box directly, its true weight disguised by lightning magic meant to spare her arms. Carrying it herself, she returned to her residence in the Eastern Palace and announced her arrival. Sedila greeted her from behind the partition of the drawing room, busy with preparations, and asked for a moment more. At Sedila's call, Michael stepped out from behind the partition. The sight stole Eve's breath. Gone was the chained homunculus of the aerial prison. Michael stood transformed, hair neatly trimmed, posture strong, dressed in the ornate burgundy uniform of an imperial direct knight. The uniform was impractical, designed for display rather than battle, but on him it looked flawless. Eve could only stare, struck by a beauty so overwhelming it was almost dangerous. Even knowing him from her past life did not dull its impact. Michael asked bluntly if something was wrong. Eve denied it and invited him to sit. As he approached, the faint scent of white tea lingered around him, the result of a recent bath, and Eve had to steady herself before speaking normally again. She complimented the uniform and apologized for not yet providing him a sword, promising to secure a suitable one soon using the reward she had received from the Emperor. Michael explained calmly that direct knights often received no weapon, as the imperial family viewed them as decorative symbols rather than true soldiers. When Eve began to feel apologetic, he clarified he was only stating facts. Their conversation drifted to his education at the training center, how, as a top-ranked homunculus, he had been taught court etiquette and the ways of serving the royal family. His cynicism darkened at the words, and Eve understood what those lessons had truly entailed. Unable to respond, she redirected the moment toward tea instead. Eve knew then that this meeting mattered. The imprint was not enough. Within 2 years, Michael would awaken fully, his power eclipsing the engraving's control. If she relied on domination alone, she would repeat her past failure. What she needed was trust, partnership. Determined, Eve dismissed Sedila and prepared the tea herself. Drawing on a memory from her past life, one of the only times she had ever shared tea with Michael, she recalled his fondness for a brew whose color matched her eyes. Concluding it must have been oolong, she blended a new mixture with pear fragrance and brewed it carefully in her favorite porcelain set. As the tea steeped, Eve asked him how it felt to be free. Michael paused, gazing out the window at the green lawn beyond the trees. At last, he answered quietly, "It reminds me of your hair color." And in that understated reply, Eve sensed the fragile beginning of something that could change the future. Eve snapped back at Michael's comment about her hair, still sensitive to how it had long been treated as nothing more than a backdrop for Rosnit's brilliance. Michael, unaware of the weight behind her reaction, simply nodded, accepting it without question. Then, unexpectedly, he called her beautiful. The words, spoken plainly and without calculation, caught Eve off guard. Flustered, she tried to redirect the moment by talking about the palace gardens, only for Michael to clarify, calmly, insistently, that he meant her hair. The frankness unsettled her more than any practiced flattery. Eve confronted him about it. He hated the royal family, hadn't he said so himself? Michael admitted it immediately, then faltered when reminded that Eve was royalty. Confusion crossed his face as he realized something had changed. His hatred dulled when he looked at her, as though the imprint was interfering with his emotions. The realization disturbed him. He feared the engraving might someday force true loyalty onto him without his consent. Eve reassured him with absolute certainty, something only she, knowing the future, could promise. He found her confidence unsettling, even as he noted how freely she allowed him to speak without honorifics. Eve brushed it off as a joke, claiming the privilege was exclusive to him. Michael accepted it, though the imprint's influence clearly weighed on him. As the hourglass emptied, Eve poured the tea she had carefully prepared, oolong blended with pear, decorated with floating buds, and set out simple biscotti. They shared the moment in silence, savoring what was, for Eve, the first true tea time she had ever had with him across both lifetimes. Then Michael asked what she had truly wanted to say. Eve answered plainly. She wanted to become crown princess, then emperor. Her goal was not power for its own sake, but the liberation of all homunculi, ending their creation, closing the training camps, and granting them full rights as imperial subjects. The declaration stunned him into silence. When he asked if she was serious, Eve met his gaze steadily and confirmed it. She laid out her ambition without hesitation, to be crowned by 20, to inherit the throne by 30, and for Michael to stand with her through it all. In that quiet room, over cooling tea, Eve revealed the future she intended to overturn. Recognizing the importance of Michael's training, Eve ended the tea time without hesitation. To her, devotion to magic and discipline came before sentiment. She urged him to practice and dismissed him for the night, utterly unaware of the expectations he had quietly braced himself for. Michael was stunned, not disappointed, but embarrassed by his own assumptions. In the imperial palace, the night following an engraving ceremony was often used as an excuse for humiliation. Eve, however, sent him away with nothing more than sincere concern for his growth. As he left, Sedila stopped him in the corridor. Calm and composed, she revealed a quiet truth: Eve rarely brewed and served tea herself. Only those she deeply respected had ever received such treatment. Michael was the fourth. The implications settled heavily on him. The next morning, Eve awoke still exhausted, fortified by strong tea. Michael was already waiting, properly armed, composed, and ready. Together, they went to the main palace. Desmond too received them from his jeweled throne, his gaze sharp as it appraised Michael. He spoke of him with open disdain, calling him a monster from the public prison. Eve responded calmly, explaining that Michael's refusal of baptism had not been defiance, but the result of a damaged mana circuit caused by prolonged restraint. She framed her intervention as simple luck and easy correction to an obvious flaw. The Emperor questioned her, testing her confidence and probing her intent. When Eve hesitated, Desmond too interpreted it not as fear, but humility. He praised her growth, her composure, and her worth as a member of the imperial family. Encouraged by his favor, Eve boldly requested that Michael be addressed properly, as Sir Agnito, her direct knight. The Emperor laughed and agreed, but reminded her that recognition required procedure. The room shifted. With idle authority, Desmond too called Michael forward. The oath of allegiance was about to begin. Michael stood before Emperor Desmond too like an unfeeling construct, kneeling as ordered, both knees to the floor. The oath that followed was not a blessing but a violation. The Emperor's hand seized his head with careless force, imprinting absolute obedience to imperial blood through sacred light that disguised cruelty. Michael accepted it all without resistance, even the final humiliation of kissing the floor at the Emperor's feet. When it ended, he did not look at Eve. Eve endured the audience only long enough to secure their dismissal, then led Michael away through a hidden garden path. Beneath the birch trees, she finally turned to him. Though his face remained blank, his sunken purple eyes betrayed the damage left behind. When Michael spoke, he confessed plainly that the Emperor's oath had been unbearable, nothing like Eve's imprint, which had never made him feel filthy. Eve reached out carefully, asking permission before touching his disheveled hair. She fixed what the Emperor had ruined and praised him softly for enduring. For the first time, Michael's rigid composure loosened. He thanked her formally, distantly, and walked ahead, his back straight, already resuming his role as her knight. Eve watched him go, sensing that this was a back she would rely on through the trials to come. Days later, Michael's entrance into the palace spread unease among the homunculi. Once notorious for defiance, now bound to the seventh princess, he became the target of scorn and whispered blame. Michael ignored it all. At the Colosso Arena, he trained relentlessly, shattering a mithril golem with overwhelming force and emerging unscathed. The watching homunculi saw not a peer, but a monster. As Michael cooled down, a silver-haired homunculus named Sylvestian approached and offered water, along with measured advice to restrain his strength for the princess's sake. Michael accepted both calmly. The palace had changed his status, but not his nature. 5 days into palace life, Michael's training had already destroyed more than 10 mithril golems. His sword, badly bruised and near its limit, was finally sheathed, soon to be replaced by a new blade promised by Eve. When Sylvestian commented on his overwhelming power, Michael admitted that only now had he fully mastered protecting his weapon after the removal of his restraints. The mention of Eve's gift stirred brief envy in Sylvestian, which Michael noticed but did not press. They formally introduced themselves, and Sylvestian, soon to be chosen by the 8th princess, hesitantly voiced his real concern, whether imprinting truly changed a homunculus. Michael answered honestly. Something had shifted after the engraving, but it had not erased his will. His priorities bent toward Eve, yet rejection and dislike still existed, only dulled. The truth unsettled Sylvestian, but also comforted him. Michael warned him not to surrender his sense of self completely. Homunculi were tools easily discarded, and blind devotion would only deepen the pain when abandonment came. Sylvestian agreed, then asked the one question Michael could not answer easily, whether even the 7th princess could abandon him. Michael did not respond. The thought darkened his expression before Sylvestian hurried to retract the question, insisting Eve was different. Michael accepted that, and the moment passed. They parted amicably, promising to cross swords someday, not as enemies, but equals. Elsewhere, Eve welcomed new attendants sent by the third empress, easing Sadila's long-carried burden. Once settled, Eve summoned Sadila privately and entrusted her with critical errands, commissioning Michael's sword from an obscure but gifted blacksmith named Balba Riblo, and locating a small alchemy workshop to acquire discreetly. Eve intended to build both loyalty and income, quiet preparations for the future. Alone at last, Eve gathered the documents she had been compiling since her return. Between plans for business, alchemy, and a magic crystal mine, she worked steadily, already weaving the foundation of power she would one day need. The pieces were moving. Slowly, but deliberately. Overwhelmed by preparations for her path as crown princess, Eve worked until dusk without noticing time pass. When sunset finally bled red across the sky, she closed her books with magic and went out for a walk, intending nothing more than fresh air. On impulse, she headed to the Colosso arena. To her surprise, she encountered Michael just as he was leaving training. Heat still clung to him, sweat dampening his hair and skin, proof of his sincerity. Eve dismissed her maids without thought, leaving the two alone on the quiet palace road. She claimed she had come without purpose. Michael offered a walk, then realized he barely knew the palace at all. 5 days of non-stop training had confined him to the arena. Understanding, Eve smiled and took the lead, guiding him herself. As they walked beneath the sunset, they spoke casually of the upcoming banquet, of etiquette, of palace life. Eve was relieved to hear he had avoided other members of the imperial family. For now, she wanted him unseen, untouched by rival gazes. She led him to the glass greenhouse garden. Inside, light, greenery, and flowing water surrounded them in quiet splendor. Michael was visibly struck by the beauty, so unlike the harsh training grounds of his past. He praised the space sincerely, noting the delicate magical system maintaining its environment. Eve, pleased, agreed, and then remembered what she had nearly forgotten. Homunculi could not use alchemy. The thought led her further, to forbidden knowledge, to her past life, to the impossible truth that Michael once fathered a child. Lost in speculation, she stared at him too intently. When Michael asked what she was thinking, the unfiltered answer slipped out. The idea of making a baby. The misunderstanding landed instantly. Flustered, Michael tried to explain the biological impossibility. Eve hurried to correct herself, clarifying that her interest was academic, not personal, but the awkwardness lingered thickly in the air. Embarrassed, Eve abruptly decided to return. Michael obeyed without comment, walking ahead as ordered. Watching his straight, dependable back, Eve felt an unexpected calm settle in her chest. For now, at least, this was enough. Rosanet's birthday arrived at last, throwing the imperial palace into motion from dawn. The morning was reserved for the selection of her direct knight, the afternoon for a banquet grand enough to center the entire court around a single princess. Eve's residence was no exception. Her new maids worked with fervor, preparing her with a beauty bath so foul-smelling it resembled witchcraft, yet effective enough to leave her skin flawless by noon. As Eve rested, Sadila reported on the delayed imprinting ceremony of the 8th princess, a delay Eve expected. Rosanet always obtained what she wanted, no matter the cost. Michael, Eve learned, had arrived early and was already being groomed. With Sadila's reassurance that propriety allowed it, Eve went to the drawing room. There, she found Michael seated as attendants dressed him. When he stood to greet her, his robe slipped, revealing a body sculpted by relentless training. Eve narrowly kept her composure. Though she intended only a brief greeting, Michael asked her to stay. Dressing, he admitted quietly, made him uneasy. Eve obliged, taking a seat nearby as his attendants enthusiastically prepared him for the banquet. They spoke of palace customs, of how authority was reinforced through appearance, how strict etiquette disguised indulgence, and how even men were shaped into objects of desire within the imperial social circle. Michael questioned the contradiction. Eve could only half defend it. As makeup and ornamentation continued, Eve observed with new awareness how the imprint had subtly shortened the distance between them. Michael relied on her presence without realizing it. And in the center of the imperial marriage market, beneath silk, chains, and unspoken rules, both of them prepared to step into the gaze of the court. At the imperial palace banquet, Men were dressed to display the bodies honed by swordsmanship and discipline. Open front dress shirts, loose ascot ties, and decorative body chains turned the male form into a sanctioned spectacle, a custom born generations ago and embraced by aristocratic women as part of courtly culture. Michael's preparation followed those rules precisely. His attendants refined his appearance with practiced confidence, finishing his face with subtle but dangerous eye makeup meant to draw attention without altering his features. When Eve finally looked at him, she was caught off guard, not by excess, but by how effortlessly captivating he had become. The body chain draped across his torso only emphasized the effect, creating a restrained decadence that suited both the palace and Michael himself. Even the black lace eye patch prepared for him, meant to mark homunculi and maintain control in crowds, felt less like regulation and more like symbolism Eve bitterly recognized. When it was Eve's turn to dress, Michael waited. Her appearance, flowing chiffon, silver cape, and amethyst ornaments, left him momentarily speechless. For someone raised far from courtly splendor, the transformation was overwhelming. His reaction, unguarded and sincere, eased Eve's lingering embarrassment. Fireworks soon signaled the end of Rosinette's long engraving ceremony. The celebration was about to begin. As the palace buzzed with gossip and anticipation, Eve quietly acknowledged the shift. Sir Millard now belonged to another princess. And the night moved forward, bound by rules, spectacle, and choices that would not remain harmless for long. Eve spoke gently of Sylvester's future, unaware that Michael could not hear the sorrow in her voice. He misread it as pity for another night, and his response, cool, edged with jealousy, cut sharper than intended. Eve denied it calmly, reaffirming that Michael alone was her direct knight and that she would never replace him. Before the attendants, their exchange became a quiet display of loyalty and possession, convincing onlookers and reassuring Eve herself. Once Michael's lace eye patch was tied, masking his elaborate makeup, the decadent impression only deepened. With the banquet about to begin, Michael formally offered his arm. Public decorum returned between them as they entered the hall together. The birthday banquet was already overflowing with nobles beneath cascades of white roses, Rosinette's symbol. With the hostess still absent, music and gossip filled the delay. Eve's entrance caused a visible stir, late, composed, and escorted by homunculus night. Whispers followed her steps, but she ignored them, relying on poise learned in a previous life. Michael quietly asked for instructions. Eve told him to remain beside her and to warn her if troublesome royals approached. She then made her first move, approaching Baroness Pernello with kindness disguised as courtesy. Through careful conversation, shared drinks, and calculated proximity, Eve drew the young noblewoman in. She revealed future dangers, floods, monsters, political vulnerability, under the guise of scholarly deduction, offering help without demanding loyalty outright. As the Baroness listened in growing trust, Eve smiled, certain of her judgment. The Pernello family, neutral in her past life and powerful in the present, would make valuable allies this time. And so, amid roses, rumors, and restrained glances, Eve began quietly reshaping the future, one conversation at a time. From there, Eve continued circulating through the hall, greeting elders, entertaining young nobles, and carefully polishing her image. With Rosinette still absent, attention gathered around Eve instead. Whispers spread of her newfound sociability, her composure, her strange but striking knight. Eve neither denied nor corrected the rumors. Instead, she let them bloom. Michael's imprisonment was reframed as proof of uncontrollable strength. Eve's authority over him became a royal favor. Being favored by the emperor was a rumor worth keeping. Soon, she was surrounded. Michael quietly warned her of approaching royal siblings. Without hesitation, he repositioned her, guiding her through the crowd and shielding her from confrontation. Eve slipped away, once again reminded that Michael was not merely her knight, but her most reliable defense as she navigated a court already beginning to turn in her favor. Only after crossing the banquet hall diagonally did Eve allow herself to stop. The ache in her feet demanded it. Fatigue crept in, and she leaned briefly into Michael's arm, confessing that her heels were unforgiving. Without comment, he supported her more firmly and searched for a place of rest, but Eve refused. Michael insisted and slowly lowered Eve on a nearby poof. She watched as he sat back on his heels and gently removed her foot from the heeled shoe. His intentions soon became clear as he raised his hand over her foot and a soft light engulfed her foot. Michael had healed Eve's injured foot. The action startled Eve, and as she gazed at Michael, a blush crept across her cheeks. He maintained eye contact, but their moment was soon interrupted by an approaching figure. A young nobleman appeared and greeted her with exaggerated courtesy, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He introduced himself as Alban Redman, second son of Count Redman and a member of the Protocol Department. The name struck Eve at once. In her past life, Alban had risen without merit, abused his position, and siphoned off imperial funds, including hers. He had been clever, meticulous, and impossible to indict. Michael immediately moved to shield her, but Eve acknowledged Alban calmly. A public conflict with the Redman family would only complicate her second life. Instead, she listened. Alban spoke bitterly of rumors that branded him a winged noble, claiming he had been deliberately suppressed by Count Sanchez, a political rival of his father. As Eve pieced together timelines from her past life, the explanation fit. His stagnation had not been incompetence, but obstruction. It did not excuse his crimes, yet it reframed his ambition. Eve adjusted her judgment. Lowering her voice, she gave him a task disguised as concern: the records surrounding Rosinet's ceremony. Unapproved sacrifices had clearly been used, and the documentation would need to be quietly corrected before it became a stain on the imperial family. Alban, whose talents lay precisely in manipulation of records, understood at once. Flattered and trusted, he accepted eagerly and departed at once. As his back disappeared into the crowd, Eve let her social smile fade. Her gaze shifted to her next objective, a tight-knit group of 6 academy students from Gnosis, younger sons with no right of succession. In her past life, 2 of them would eventually defy expectations and inherit their houses. Their bond, forged by shared exclusion, made them difficult to approach. This time, Eve released Michael's arm. To lower their guard, she approached alone, poised, smiling, openly visible. With a simple request for a drink, she stepped into their circle, aware of the assessing gazes that followed her. She did not retreat from them. The social world was, at its core, a marriage market, and Eve intended to use its rules, not fight them. Among 6, she only needed one opening. And she smiled, ready to take it. Eve stepped into the circle of academy nobles with careful intent, expecting resistance, but instead, 2 voices answered her. That alone was a victory. Most unexpected of all was Calix Ramatiello, the group's unspoken center, who quietly made space at his side. The silent looks exchanged among the others told Eve everything. This was not supposed to happen. Conversation followed, stories of the academy, shared laughter, but beneath it, the tone shifted. 1 glass became 2. Then 3. Your glass is empty, princess. Take mine this time. Eve recognized the trap instantly. The first drinks were harmless, the next deliberately stronger. It was an old cruelty, one she knew too well. Once again, they were testing how much a princess could endure before breaking. Her hesitation drew Calix's gaze. With a faint smile, he offered, "If it's difficult, you may pass the glass to me." Before Eve could decide, a calm voice cut through the tension. "I will drink instead." Michael stepped forward. He took the glass from Eve's hand, then the next, and drank them both without pause. The motion was smooth, unshaken, almost beautiful. Not even the color of his face changed. "Sir Agnito, are you all right?" Eve asked, startled. "No problem." The room cooled. Calix clicked his tongue, acknowledging defeat. Michael's presence had shattered the game, not with anger, but with certainty. "I am here. You cannot touch her." Eve withdrew with him to the balcony, the night air finally letting her breathe. "There," she admitted softly, "I forgot I had someone to rely on." Michael answered without hesitation. "Next time, give it to me." For the first time, Eve felt it clearly, not strategy, not calculation, but relief. It felt good to have someone on her side. Then the music stopped. A voice rang through the hall. Her Imperial Highness, the 8th Princess, Rosinette Nadia Hadelamid, and her direct knight, Sir Sylvestre Millard, now enter. From the staircase descended Rosinette, radiant as a white rose in full bloom, Sylvestre at her side. The hall overflowed with admiration. "She grows more beautiful every year." That silver-haired homunculus, perfect for her. Rosinette heard it all and smiled. Turning to Sylvestre, she asked sweetly, "How does it feel to be the direct knight of the Empire's White Rose?" "It is the highest honor," he replied. "You must shine for me," she said, gentle words, sharpened with command. Sylvestre bowed and obeyed in silence. From the shadows of the balcony, Eve watched. The banquet had shifted. Pieces were moving. And beneath the music and roses, fate had begun to tighten its grip once more. The 8th princess, Rosnet Nadia Hadelamid, officially opened her 16th birthday banquet, thanking the assembled nobles for celebrating both her coming of age and the selection of her direct knight. Thunderous applause followed, marking the true beginning of the evening. Seated upon a chair crowned with blooming white roses, Rosnet received guests one by one. Mousse cakes were served in wine glasses as nobles lined up to offer congratulations, praising her beauty and the rarity of her silver-haired homunculus knight. She responded with practiced grace, every smile polished. Her followers, the 4th Prince Rubens and 5th Prince Icalis, cut through the line, loudly flaunting their closeness. Their careless remarks, disguised as affection, openly implied the difficulty of her engraving ceremony and her lack of alchemical talent. Rosnet's smile hardened. Whispers spread among the nobles. The tension eased only when Princess Bridget arrived, presenting herself as a loving elder sister. Their exchange was cordial, calculated, politics masked as affection. Bridget praised Rosnet's success in claiming Sir Sylvester Millard, subtly reframing the engraving difficulties as an unavoidable challenge. Before Rosnet could respond, Sylvester knelt, accepted blame with humility, and kissed the back of her hand. The romantic display drew sighs of admiration, restoring Rosnet's composure. Time passed. The cake tower dwindled. The lines vanished. Rosnet remained seated, smiling dutifully through boredom, until murmurs rippled through the hall. The 7th Princess Eve had arrived. Escorted by Michaelis Agneto, Eve walked beneath the chandeliers with calm dignity. Gone was the withdrawn girl Rosnet remembered. Her posture was composed, her gaze steady, so noble that it unsettled Rosnet. Whispers followed her steps, some even claiming Eve had seemed like the banquet's true centerpiece before Rosnet's arrival. Hostility flared behind Rosnet's ruby eyes. Eve greeted her warmly, offering sincere congratulations and praising her as the Empire's blooming white rose. Rosnet answered stiffly and deliberately handed her the least appealing cake. Eve, unfazed, also congratulated Sylvester with perfect courtesy, earning his subdued but respectful reply. Rosnet's attention then shifted to Michael. The infamous silver-haired homunculus radiated an eerie presence, more beast than knight. Intrigued, Rosnet requested an introduction. Eve complied uneasily. Michael offered a flawless, restrained bow. Rosnet did not respond. Instead, she extended her hand. The hall froze. It was well known that the Imperial White Rose never offered her hand for a kiss. Eve's tension spiked, recognizing a familiar obsession from her past life. Yet Michael stepped forward without hesitation. He knelt. Taking Rosnet's hand, he pressed his lips to it in perfect knightly form, sealing a moment that drew every eye in the room and quietly shifted the balance of power once more. Yet as Eve watched, a hollow sensation spread through her fingertips, a faint echo of loss she couldn't name. Greetings again to the 8th princess. Yes. Nice to meet you, Sir Agneto. Rosnet smiled brightly, satisfied. Michael rose and returned to Eve's side, and that was when she noticed it. He lifted his gloved hand and deliberately wiped his lips. Did you wipe it? Eve whispered, startled. Michael leaned close enough that only she could hear him. Because it's unpleasant if it's not my princess. It was an unforgivable rudeness, grounds for a duel if seen. Yet Eve smiled despite herself. The warmth of it lingered longer than it should have. Before she could withdraw, the banquet hall stirred. His Majesty the Emperor has arrived. Blessings and glory to the son of Hadelamide. Desmond too entered, commanding the hall with ease. Rosnet rose instantly, radiant with joy, greeting him with affectionate reverence. He praised her, apologized for his brief stay, and announced his gift, a white rose garden prepared just for her. The nobles gasped. A private garden was proof of extraordinary favor. Eve stood beside him, painfully aware of the comparison forming in every watching eye. If gossip is unavoidable, she thought, then I will wear misfortune gracefully. She lowered her gaze, soft and subdued, playing the role expected of her. She did not notice Rosnet's triumphant glance, but she did feel Michael's hand tighten around hers. He's telling me he's on my side. Her faint, unintended smile drew sighs from nearby nobles. Then the Emperor turned to her. Eve, if there is anything you want, tell me. I will grant it. The hall stilled. After a pause, Eve spoke carefully. I would like to relocate Abima. Not a laboratory, Not wealth. Simply a larger residence, one with a powder room and a balcony. Desmond II's expression darkened. There was no powder room? In a princess's residence. His anger shook the hall. Eve intervened gently, reminding him it was Rosenet's birthday. Soothed, the emperor relented, then summoned the palace officials. The seventh princess, Ivian Rose Clolhadelamid, is granted the Room of Greenery in the East Palace. The banquet erupted. A named room was no lesser gift than a garden. Eve bowed deeply, gratitude flawless, welcoming even the promise of her father's future visits. When Desmond II departed, satisfied, Eve turned to bid Rosenet farewell. That was when she saw it. The birthday girl's smile was gone. In its place a resentment, sharp and unmistakable, burning in ruby-pink eyes. And in that instant, Eve understood. Today, the emperor had spoken more to her than to Rosenet. And Rosenet had noticed.